So, we beat Homecoming. This one was a little bit different. It was pretty okay. There were some decent things going on with it, and I think that they learned some interesting lessons, but I also think that maybe some of the things that were most interesting about previous campaigns got left by the wayside. This is going to be a review of the gameplay and storytelling mechanics of Homecoming, and basically how the whole campaign is put together. We've already got a review of all of the Homecoming cards up. Spoiler alert, they're very powerful. Basically, like, this is a campaign that's very, very good to get if you want to get started on the current meta and get a really interesting series of inroads into some cool Ixtun decks and Aurelian stuff. If you want to basically like break up the Winchest madness, this is a pretty good set for it. But we want to talk about the game, and let's go ahead and talk about like sort of how things are put together and what we like about it. So first things first, in terms of like overall rankings, I would not put this one terribly highly in terms of campaigns that have influenced. Tale of Horus Traver was really interesting and established some really cool things about the world. Vara had some really fascinating, like, just interesting asides going on, and there was some really good information revealed. And like, we had a really, really good time with the Icaria one as well. So like, most of these campaigns have been pretty good, and this one didn't really quite hit the mark for me. Didn't find much there to invest in emotionally, and there were some good characters introduced, but not really a lot of information revealed overall. The primary goal of this was to establish a scion, specifically a new green scion, Sveta, and as far as things go, that was sort of accomplished, but I'm also like not really sure that I care for Sveta anymore, which is interesting because she's a character that I've actually been fairly interested in and I thought was pretty well established previously. So let's talk a little bit about it and what all we have to go through. So first things first, pre-constructed decks. This is a new campaign setting that they're playing with, where basically we have these pre-constructed decks that you get access to. You don't play with your own decks, and that makes a world of difference in terms of balancing out gameplay, making the experience even for everybody, and also making it so that you can better tutorialize and like have people who are playing the campaigns for the first time to gain cards learn things about particular play styles and particular types of decks that you can function with. Each of the decks in the campaign arcs plays a little bit differently. They're sort of manned by different characters. One of them's manned by Andrik, one of them's manned by Cameron. One of them's sort of manned by Sveta, and one of them is a little bit Milos-y. But, well, it's mostly a Milos deck, and then there's kind of a Sveta deck at the end and a Yushkov deck at the beginning. But, like, overall, I would say that, like, all of these decks are pretty cool, and they establish some decent things that are slight character moments, but also, like, just have good gameplay and sort of change around how you play the game and introduce you to the different color factions. I think that's good. I think that basically, like, campaign stuff is something where you can add extra value to players who are experiencing the game for the first time or who are fairly new and are accumulating cards. And I think that just like in terms of future-proofing, this is something that does pretty well. That being said, there were some issues where we would lose games pretty frequently due to RNG, like they are limited decks for the most part. I wouldn't say that it was like particularly bad. Oftentimes I could blame whatever error that I had on a particular mistake. I don't think I lost that many games as a result of anything other than me misinterpreting what our opponent was playing or sort of not really understanding what my deck was doing correctly the first time around. So like there's some stuff at the end where it's pretty difficult, but I wouldn't say that the campaign difficulty was too high or anything was too crazy. I've seen some complaints on the Reddit from people who may not have done very well with it, so that might be an indication that it should be lower difficulty if you want to just get through to get all the cards. But at the same time, I want like higher difficulty modes with more puzzles too, because I like a challenge, and this was a campaign. As a campaign, it was average gameplay, but like really not much interesting happened. It just sort of felt like playing a round of Limited against the AI, and I specifically avoid gameplay modes like Gauntlet and Forge because I don't find them terribly interesting. Human players are always much more fun to play against for me. So, yeah, I think the precons were a good idea. I'd actually rather they stick with that for the campaign mode, but certainly there are some potential improvements that can be made. Specifically, I think it's really got to be more of a focus on puzzles like the bear fight that we encountered later in the round, and less of a focus on like specific precon versus precon stuff where you're just seeing like one deck of Limited face off against another deck of Limited, and it's just sort of a matter of how well you can play the AI. Okay, So that's like my basic impression on precons. What else do we have? I have a bunch of notes here. First things first, establishing characters. We're going to talk about the lore a little bit. So there are a bunch of characters, new and old, being introduced in this whole setup. Basically, like, Homecoming has been about a far different cast from the Scions that we currently know. We're doing a lot of world building. We're trying to establish some new places and new people, some new villains, and also tie it all back into the world at large, the sort of larger, like, Xenon conflict that seems to be going on, where everybody's like sort of moving into a fight with the Shadowlands, and we're positioning to have a set of 5 Scions again with Sveta at the core. There are about 6 major characters, and we're going to talk about each of them in turn. First off, we have Yushkov, who is, in this case, pretty much a standard bad guy. He has a few neat character moments in this. You get to play around as him early on when you take Kosul, and as a prologue, I think that works really well. I think Yushkov's deck is interesting. I think that he's kind of a fun character. He's a bit boisterous. His bear is really interesting, and the card for that kind of establishes some character for it. He's fairly solidly executed. He doesn't need to be fancy, and he hits most of the beats that he needs to do. I like how he sort of behaves at the end of the game, where he specifically demands to just be, like, killed. Like, that's an interesting sort of character moment for both Sveta and Yushkov, and, like, overall, I didn't find any fault with how Yushkov was presented here. I think he was an interesting villain. I think he served his purpose, and now I think he's mostly gone. Perhaps he'll come back, but overall it seemed like a pretty good character through and through. We have Milos, who is having Milos's last stand here. There's something kind of sad about Milos Azaleo, how he basically jumps from one rebellion to another, and that this life of just, like, constantly trying to find a new cause eventually gets him killed. I don't think that's established super well in the storyline, and I also kind of think that Milos is just, like, kind of a dork. Like, he's just a weird and almost comically designed character in terms of, like, art and style, and, like, while he has a few character moments in this particular setup, he also dies in a really weird way. He's actually, like, mechanically trying to establish that you're going to lose or win in, like, a couple of turns, and he starts just doing a countdown at the end. So his last words are literally 3, 2, 1, and I was just, I don't know, I laughed at that. I didn't find it to be, like, particularly interesting or a good character moment for Milos overall, and I was kind of hoping that Milos would have something interesting to say at the end, or something to say about, like, basically why it is that he did what he did, why he fights in this particular war. It's good that campaigns are willing to kill characters. I appreciate that they're continuing to do that, and I also appreciate that it wasn't like somebody getting fridged this time around. Like, this was not like a huge moment overall, but, like, also it came out of the blue a little bit, and this was something that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through each of the campaign settings. I don't know. Milos was weirdly executed pretty much through and through, but he's kind of an interesting character, so I don't know. He's got good cards, and beyond that, I don't have anything particularly good to say about his character. Ondrik, the Soulist Priest. I've kind of forgotten about this character already. He is a Soulist, and that was not, like, super well established, but, like, basically he doesn't actually seem to be that renegade at all. He's only renegade because he's in Kosul, and Soul seems to be this sort of, like, authoritarian, like, secret-keeping organization that has a bunch of stuff under lock and key and uses, like, basically is, like, in control of a bunch of Xenon secrets, which is really interesting and sort of fun to establish, but Ondrik does not, like, do anything personally interesting beyond, like, sort of be a Soulist, similar to how we've seen Genetrix earlier on in the storyline. So overall, there wasn't many good character moments for this guy. He just kind of exists to chase Severin around, and I have some peeves about that, specifically that, like, he kind of takes the reins in the late part of the plot, which is a little bit irritating because this is a story that is primarily about Sveta. Cameron. This is a new character. She's pretty well established, and I would say that this is definitely not the end of her story. Cameron is pretty interesting as a foil to Sveta. She's pretty stone scarry. She actually, like, covers her color pairings well. I think she's a well-established character, and it's kind of a pity her card is not that good. As far as Cameron's story goes, it seems to hit all the right beats, but then at the very end, it kind of makes a switch to Milos, so it kind of just bails on her storyline, and we'd expect to pick that up again at some point, or see something interesting happen with Cameron, but at the moment all we have is just, like, a pretty cool new character that has been introduced in the storyline and was pretty well established. Like, I think that they did a pretty good job with that. Severin. Severin's fairly newish, and, like, he was weird this one. He was kind of like the strange cackling madman. He ends on this, like, sort of weird, funny, maniacal laugh and just kind of, like, leaves. Like, he's just like, I'm out. You don't really fight him very much. He's sort of, like, in the background, and then he he's like, well, you're not actually supposed to fight me. I'm going to go, like, be a villain later on. And that's kind of a weird thing to have as sort of the secondary thing going on. I feel like Severin was not terribly well treated in this particular setup. There are some interesting, creepy things that happen with him, but he could have been made to be a more dangerous character, and, like, it's really, really strange how mechanically he sort of kidnaps Sveta and just basically takes her. It's really an odd story beat that we'll talk about as we talk about, like, how the campaign was executed. So that gives us our last character, Sveta, the Merciful Arene. And this is, I think, where Homecoming really kind of doesn't work. It kind of falls flat a little bit. So Sveta is a fairly interesting kind of like offensive Anastasia character. She's like a princess who has been like taken away from her throne and is trying to get that throne back and be like a better king or a better queen as far as things go, a better Aren. And like there's some things that go on with Sveta that are basically like, the problem that we have here is that, well, Sveta is narrating the story. She's kind of the POV character for everything. You don't really play as Sveta very often throughout the campaign. You play primarily as Milos or Cameron. At the very end of the story, you play as Andrik, and then like eventually Sveta gets to that final fight, and you have one fight with Moknadi, Sveta's bear, in which Sveta is not participating, and then you have the final fight where she doesn't really talk much or do anything like interesting. There's not a lot of dialogue between her and Yushkov, and then at the end they have their big moment and we have a new Scion. And like I just don't think that there's enough work done on making Sveta out what she is supposed to be, which is to be the big Justice Scion. There's a lot of times where people are talking to Sveta and they're specifically like, we don't necessarily trust you, or like, we are siding with Yushkov because your father was kind of a jerk and like he wasn't a good king and he left people hungry. And she's like, well, that won't happen if I'm Aren. And everyone is just like, well, yeah, okay, prove it. And then nothing. Like basically like Sveta is super passive throughout the storyline. You don't play as her as a character. There are some specific story beats where it's stuff like Cameron is doing very bad things and killing people and like losing the trust of the people and being kind of vicious and awful, and Sveta's response is to just sort of be like, this is a bad thing that's happening. And then we switch to Milos sort of like supporting Cameron and dying for the cause. And you'd expect that to be kind of a motivating factor, or something that like might actually like lead Sveta to like do a better job and like work without Cameron and change something up about what's going on. But then we get into the next chapter and it's all about Andrik chasing Severin, and sort of like Andrik is taking the reins of the plot and sort of making it about finding Severin and basically changing up their strategy a bunch, while Sveta is still sort of in the background, not really doing anything. So the character is really passive, like doesn't actually accomplish a lot over the course of the round, and this really comes to a head at the end of it, where basically Andrik finally like catches Severin after a series of battles and series of strange like events, and then Severin is just like, well, no, I've actually caught you, and then really weirdly ends up just sort of kidnapping Sveta and throwing her in a dungeon, at which point she's completely lost, like she's been captured, and the only reason that she takes the throne is because Yushkov is brash and sort of kind of the vicious person who's just like, yeah, sure, I'll challenge you to a duel. And then they duel and they lose, and Yushkov loses, and Sveta's big character moment is to spare Yushkov. At this point, Yushkov is surrounded by supporters. He has basically like done everything that he has set out to do. Like he's accomplished all of his goals, and like Sveta hasn't really like fomented a large rebellion or won the trust of the people or done anything to basically like get rid of any of the keys to Yushkov's power. She's just sort of defaced Yushkov and like made it so that Yushkov is humiliated. So like exiling Yushkov doesn't really seem like it should work, because all of his supporters are still there and everyone could just like, I don't know, like kill Sveta at this point. But like it does, which is fine. Like if you are going to do that, that's okay. But at that point, it probably would have been better to just walk up and challenge Yushkov to a duel, like at the start of the story, because none of anything else that led up to that point really seems to matter all that much. So it's a problem. Like, there's some real issues with how Sveta is executed, and now we have like maybe some opportunities to see Sveta as an actual merciful Oren, or like a character who can actually fix problems, but I suspect we're not going to see that. I suspect what we're going to see is basically like the next chapter will be about the Shadowlands invading and Sveta being the person to defend. And, you know, that brings up questions of like, you know, what all this is intended to accomplish in terms of like making a new Justice Scion and like what kind of character this is supposed to be. Yeah, so my feelings on Sveta are not very strong. I don't think that she's a particularly active protagonist. We have a really good active female protagonist in Eternal, which is Eileen. Eileen has done a lot of stuff where basically, like, she falls out of power, she takes power back, and this happens multiple times. She's actually proven herself pretty capable of taking Argenport, I think, twice in the course of her lifetime, and, like, when she's not in power, she's still doing things that, like, establish that she's going to be a good ruler, like in cards like Aid of the Huru and sort of like the plot line. She's taking care of refugees. She's like doing active things in the plot to sort of make sure that her people are okay and to unite the clans and Argenport together and make things like a little bit better. She does like some good things as well by basically uniting with her son-in-law and her daughter to like establish the trifecta. So we have like some really interesting establishing character moments with Eileen. And I was kind of hoping for something along those lines with Sveta to sort of make this character look more interesting, or at the very least a turn to like show why this character maybe shouldn't be Oren, maybe some sort of like actual change up where like Yushkov wins. Like if Severin is saying that there are no happy endings, like what happens there? Like there's just some weird places where like this doesn't actually work out, and I'm just very, very, I'm not sure about the execution of the storyline on that front. So those are the 6 characters that we've got established, and I think that like really the fact that this is Sveta's story and we're not seeing a lot out of Sveta in it is kind of a failing for this story, and the primary reason that the story failed for me. So yeah, let's talk about the particular campaigns and settings. So we have different sections for each campaign. The first is Khoravyat Burning, which is the section where Yushkov invades, and we get like the sort of ultimatum from Sveta's father to go and find help. And I think this section's executed perfectly well. It's really interesting to play as Yushkov in the first part of the story. It's good establishing for your villain. It basically does everything it's supposed to do. And then at the end, like, Sveta gets like the whole storyline there is fine. It's told in one story, so there's no filler. There's nothing boring about it. It's just an interesting thing that gets used to the precons, and it seems like it does pretty well, so I'm all set for that. Homecoming, the second chapter, holds some defining moments for Milos, as basically the entire objective of this chapter is to find the Resistance and to find Cameron, and we get that final like surprise reveal of Cameron there, where Sveta actually has a sister who's alive. So there's some good stuff that's happening here. There's a little bit of filler where basically we are fighting Yetis and dinosaurs and things like that in some of these campaign sections, but I would say that overall like it does okay, and like Milos sort of being Milos and being like, no, you can't like do this or you can't do that is really, really interesting. These are moments where Sveta is just once again like, we were all ready to move on, but then Milos decided to step in and be like a person who did a heroic thing, and it's like, well, shouldn't that be you, like the primary protagonist is sort of the thing. And I get that they're trying to establish some moments for Milos before Milos dies, but also like that was a little bit strange on that front in the second campaign. The third campaign is Wolves of Winter, and this one is where it starts to get a little bit weird. So we start to establish that Cameron is definitively like a little bit evil, or at least has like a little bit of too much ambition and doesn't really care about the will of the people or like basically anything around this. And Sveta like comments on this, stuff happens. Eventually there is like a final showdown type thing that's like the penultimate showdown where Cameron is very, very evil, and then at the end of it basically Sveta says everyone was shaken at what Cameron did. And then we go to Cameron, who takes a bunch of firebombs, gives them to Milos, and then Milos dies. And this is really weird because A, this is Cameron's whole plotline coming to a close, and she's victorious, like she wins, the day as far as things go. She also gets to stay alive because it's Milos who does the heroic sacrifice. And like they blow up the barracks, and sort of like that's exactly what Cameron wanted. Like there's this sort of necessary casualties thing going on here, and then like after that, there's no comment on this. Like basically, it moves on to Andrik chasing Severin. We don't have any establishment of what's going on with Sveta or Cameron. We just sort of have like, oh, they had a fight, and then like nothing really came of that. So it's awkward because it is a good establishing setup for Cameron. It's cool to play Cameron's deck, and then like nothing really does happen there, and Milos is just sort of just sort of dies weirdly, and it doesn't quite work out. It's also, this is where the mechanics start to get a little bit tricky, because in the final fight, Milos is sort of doing a countdown, and he's like sort of having his final moments, but there isn't a real clear turn counter. Like it's basically 10 turns and you win. But like we know that there's probably going to be some fire bombs, but basically all we're getting here is that Milos is doing the countdown, and then like basically at the last 2 turns we have an idea of what's supposed to be happening, and then there's a pretty weak explosion effect, and it's sort of meant to indicate that Milos has died. Okay, cool. So mechanically, like, the Milos death doesn't really seem to be interesting. It's similar to how Ikaria just kind of explodes in the Ikaria versus Mokto fight, where it's just like, oh, that happened? Okay, I should be sad, I guess. Like, there's no mechanical execution on that. Yeah, so then we get into Desecration. Suddenly Andrik is in charge. Nothing's really happening here, and like Sveta is pretty passive for most of the time. We get a little bit of an establishment of what Severin's doing. Nightmare is being freed from Solist temples, and like a bunch of things getting destroyed. Bad stuff is happening, but then at the end of it, like basically Severin wins and walks away with like an evil laugh while Sveta gets kidnapped. Again, the mechanical execution here is really, really weird. Like we see a lot of sort of fillery fights. We're fighting like back alley bouncers in like weird slaughterhouses. Like there's a bunch of fights where we aren't like learning a lot of information, but like we're still just sort of fighting things to get cards, and that's awkward. There's some weird stuff here. It feels like there could be more like interesting character moments in those times, and then at the end of it, like it doesn't really feel like we are, you know, making any sort of impact on the plot or participating in the plot at all, because like none of the things that we've been doing have accomplished anything, and Severin just wins anyways. Then at the end we have the Winter Crown. This is where the 2 most interesting fights in the campaign happen. The first is the bear battle, which is pretty fun. Like it's a really interesting puzzle. It was pretty easy for me. I didn't have a lot of issues with it, and at the end of it we found like we were like really, really far ahead when Moknati again just kind of explodes without any particular explanation or realization. After that you have the Yushkov fight, which Yushkov frontin is okay by me. Like it's fine that Yushkov is going to be like, okay, I'll just duel you, even though like I have everything to lose and you have nothing to gain, or you have everything to gain. Like what the heck? Let's just do this. That's the kind of character I am. I'm fine with that. That's all okay. This fight was pretty okay. We did lose it the first time. You have to play pretty aggressively. You have to basically get rid of that bear as quickly as possible, and you have to have Defiance to stun that bear, or else it's going to murder you. So it takes a little bit of struggle. It's a pretty hard fight, and like it's not that hard the second time around, but I would say that it was decently challenging and gave a decent sense of tension. But then at the end, like the final execution is like a little bit rushed in dialogue. It kind of feels like these characters should have been chatting a little bit more as they dueled, because like basically they go silent during the majority of the fight. There's not a lot of dialogue between them, and this could be a really good moment for Sveta to be saying some things that establish like where her character has been over the course of this whole setup, for Yushkov to challenge her on things like Cameron and things like what's going on with Severin, for Sveta to bring up Severin and talk about like what's going on with Yushkov's priest. Like basically like all of the stuff that we've seen over the course of the campaign should be coming in to a close, and like we should be establishing like how Sveta is taking power away from Yushkov, what it is that's like causing his supporters to fail, and how it is that she's achieving victory. She needs to make Yushkov doubt himself, and she needs to do more than just sort of physically overpower Yushkov, I think. Yeah, that's my impression of it. Like, basically, like, there isn't a lot done here, and then at the end, Yushkov is just like, well, I lose, kill me, and Svetcha's like, no, and that's the end of it. So, yeah, I think there could have been more story beats hit here. I think there's a lot of opportunity for these characters to talk to each other that isn't really taken up, and that causes some problems. The most interesting fights were those two fights. The things that really could have gone better were Milos' finale and, like, the final battle of the whole setup. I think that, like, basically, like, the big highlights of this are Yushkov's opener at the very, very start, Korovyat burning, and the bear fight. Those were the two fights where I had the most fun and where I was the most interested in what was going on. So what could have made this better? What all could we have changed? How could this have been improved based on, like, what we've seen from previous things? Well, first things first, I think that mechanics should generally match the storytelling always. And there are a lot of, like, really, really cheap and simple tricks that you can be doing here to make sure that the storytelling is coming across that weren't really exploited. Eternal campaigns have a general problem of not being very flashy. Basically, every time anything happens, it's just like you fight a guy, the guy explodes, and then people talk for a little bit. Everyone has about 2 lines of dialogue, so you can play it in the first 2 turns, because that's typically the only 2 turns that you can guarantee that there's going to be dialogue. And then, like, basically everything after that is just silence until the enemy dies, and then you have another conversation. So it's just like a dialogue delivery system. Like, you can be doing a lot to mechanically match what's going on with the storytelling. So, like, when people are springing ambushes, for example, when Severin springs an ambush on Svetcha, like, if you just summon 12 guards onto Severin's side of the board before you say that Severin has now captured Svetcha, like, that mechanically puts across the idea that Severin has actually called in a bunch of guards and, like, somehow captured Svetcha. This was something that was really unclear to me. We actually skipped the dialogue by accident, because if you click too fast, which we did actually several times during this campaign, you'll skip the dialogue at the end and it won't replay. You can't, like, get it back or do anything to play it again. So that's like a little minor UI thing that we complained about in the previous campaign that they didn't fix this time around. That was very unfortunate. But yeah, like with Milos, like, you could definitely have had a card that put a bunch of firebombs into the bottom of everyone's deck so that you knew exactly where the firebombs were. Like, if the card was just a light the fuse with alternate text that said, like, okay, everyone's got 10 cards in their deck, and then the bottom 5 cards are firebombs, like, that's an easy way to establish that there's a turn timer, and you can just use the deck as the turn timer because you have a count that you can actually play around with. When Moknadi is killed, Moknadi again just explodes. Vargo coming back is pretty easy to establish. Like, Vargo has that I can't be killed by a bunch of different things going on. So, like, you could easily establish that Vargo has come back. You can cast a spell to kill the bear. You could actually maybe use some art assets this time around or do something to show that Moknadi actually died. Again, like, this is just, like, basically all of the standard death sequences are not treated with any sort of fanfare, or, like, they're just sort of events that happen, and it's really weird. It's not very good from a storytelling perspective. Like, I feel like if you're going to spend characters and try to create these emotional moments, this is something where you really need to sort of mechanically express it and clearly identify what's happening. So, like, you know, and these are just, like, really minor things that don't even have to happen in the course of the campaign. If you actually have campaign, like, puzzles and stuff like the bear fight where you actually are establishing, like, what's going on in the course of players interacting with it, it's even better. I've talked about how, like, the best current moment in Eternal for mechanically expressing storytelling is the fight where Jack kills Roland, and you just have a choice between a gun or a sword, and, like, you don't have agency or control, but, like, basically because you are offered this way of interacting, you sort of understand what the stakes are and, like, how this is happening, and the implications of it are really, really clear. And that's not very hard to do. Like, it doesn't seem like it's something that requires a lot of coding or a lot of difficulty to establish, so I felt like this was something where we just didn't quite get what we wanted. Yeah, so like basically more mechanical flair is generally pretty awesome. Decks should be built up over time. If we're going to be using pre-constructed decks, I think that it's really, really good to have from campaign to campaign to add cards in and show that you're adding cards in. This is something that we do in basically all of the tutorials to games like Magic or Hearthstone, where you basically like have a deck and then like every time you do something, you get some new cards added to the deck and it's a shiny thing. Like this is something that I think we do even in the basic campaigns. And when you're trying to find a rebellion or like establish a rebellion, this is a really easy mechanical thing where the deck could clearly change over time, and just minor upgrades with extra rares seems like a really good idea. Like if you are you can also, and this is pretty true of a couple of interesting areas, you can also take cards away from those decks. Like when Cameron is sort of like fighting people and people are starting to distrust Sveta's rebellion, this is a good time to take like rare cards or take other cards out of the deck and replace them with like more disreputable cards or like more shadow cards. Like if you want to establish that you're actually losing the fight, this is something where you can like mechanically change that up and increase the difficulty of the campaign while also like sort of showing like in the story like what's happening, what the current status of your army is, what the current status of the rebellion is. Like, you know, just basically changing the decks around seems like something that could have really been done to sort of give you a little bit more of an idea of what's going on and who's doing what. I would say that more puzzles is generally a thing that should be happening in these campaigns. Those puzzles are really, really strong. We've been wanting more like actual puzzles most of the time, but like the things like the McNaughty Bear fight are really strong examples of how you can make a campaign interesting by taking some cool mechanics and making something that's really fun and simple and like just sort of a little bit of a brain teaser. I really like the puzzle style for campaigns because it gives us the ability to sort of interact with this kind of stuff in a way that is a little bit different from playing standard Eternal. And since the campaigns are just reasons to play more Eternal versus AI for the most part, making it as interesting as possible and as different as possible is usually, I think, in the interest of a good game. Like AI battles are just not that exciting for the most part. If you're a real big Gauntlet fan, then yay, but I don't know. I feel like those are the fights that tend to stand out in people's mind in every campaign, is when you have to do something weird and like there's a bunch of different like sort of pre-constructed hurdles that you have to get over through careful decision making. They don't have a lot of replayability, but like they are also the most replayable things in the campaign because like they stick in your head and you sort of get the idea of like, man, I want to go try that again and see if I can do this thing differently. Like, yeah, I'm pretty all about those like simple puzzle designs. Those are really good campaign fights. The final thing that I would say needs to change up is a little bit less filler. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to remove filler fights like the Yeti fights or the dinosaur fights. But very frequently in the campaign, we'd have this sort of section where it's like, okay, we're going to this place, we're going to that place, and we're going to basically like, there's going to be a brief break while we fight this Yeti. And it's sort of like removing some of the tension. We get to like establish some like more world building stuff and show some of the other characters. Using that on Yeti is always a little bit weird because Yeti are everywhere and everyone knows about them and everyone knows everything that they do. Whereas like we still have a lot of other factions that we haven't explored, like elves are for some reason really popular right now in Homecoming, and they have no place in the storyline or anywhere else. So like we still don't know anything about a lot of these different factions. But yeah, like basically my point would be that if you are fighting these Yetis and dinosaurs and other things, this is a good time to have characters who are in your party or who are in the current storyline to talk to each other and establish some interesting story beats. Like this is a good time for Milos and Sveta to have some like actual back and forth, do some actual like writing work on their characters and do something other than just be like, oh, here's a scary Yeti. We don't like Yetis, let's fight the Yeti. Same thing with like fighting dinosaurs. Like if you're doing one of these like sort of chiller moments, this is a good point to sort of like start establishing characters and helping you like those characters a little bit more. Every story beat in the campaign, every campaign beat should have something that actually like does something to advance your characters, if not your plot. And I think that like those particular filler fights were a little bit annoying on that front, because they'd just be like kind of a thing where it's like, well, fight this thing and you'll get the cards for it, and then we'll move on to the next part of the story. And like there's a lot of parts of the story that are really undersold, and a lot of parts of the story that are really under executed. So I think it would be a really good idea to have like these sort of like minor filler moments. So yeah, those are the main things. Less filler, more puzzles, build up decks over time, and actually have like a lot of mechanical stuff that is like much more diverse mechanically than just like fighting AI opponents. And finally, like use mechanics to tell story, because there's plenty of extra cards that you can be throwing out here to basically like make that visually occur in some good ways. Finally, like as far as lore goes, make sure that the protagonist is always active. Make sure that the protagonist is specifically trying to accomplish a goal and moving towards or moving away from that goal as a result of their own actions. This is something that Sveta just doesn't really do very much. Like a lot of her party members do the dirty work, and that's a frustrating aspect of like establishing what is supposed to be the big penultimate new scion. Yeah, the new scion is great. It's a little bit passive itself, so I guess par for the course. But yeah, overall, Homecoming was decent. I would not say it was like a huge winner in my books, but there was some good execution. The precons were a good idea. I'm looking forward to more campaigns, of course, but I really want to see more development on these, because like they haven't changed much since Jack's Bounty. There have been some mild upgrades, but basically they still have sort of the same low quality feel to them, and I feel like it's not. You can do a lot of things on a budget that can still increase the quality of these campaigns and make them much more worth playing, and much more worth playing again. Lastly, I would really like to see some like harder mode versions of these campaigns. I would love to see some like harder puzzles, or like a second playthrough. That would be kind of cool. Currently, they don't really have any replayability, so that would be nice as well. Yeah, so that's my impressions on Homecoming. It was well worth the buy, obviously, because the cards in it are great, but the lore aspects of it didn't thrill me, and I actually came out of it with less of an opinion on Sveta than I had previously. And I did like Sveta. I still do like Sveta. I'm hoping that Sveta does exciting and interesting things in the plot from here on out, but right now, I don't have a lot of reason to care about them, and that's a bit of a bummer. That's it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. We will be back with more Eternal Brews and campaign stuff very, very soon. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.